Okay, I think we're live again. Yeah, oh good. So I'm going to turn off the video for everyone. So now you should all be able to see there is basically 8 minutes left. When this clock goes to 0, that's when we start. Okay.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes. So welcome to, I'm in Barcelona, I'm Mel Slater, I'm in Barcelona. Sylvia Pan is in London, and Doug Bowman is in Virginia in the United States. Welcome to this next session of the Frontiers in Virtual Reality Editor Seminars. So today I'm very happy to introduce Doug Bowman. He is the Frank J. Maher Professor of Computer Science and Director of the Center for Human-Computer Interaction at Virginia Tech. He obtained his PhD in computer science from the Georgia Institute of Technology. He's the principal investigator of the 3D interaction group there, which focuses on topics of three-dimensional user interface design and the benefits of immersion. He's one of the authors of the book 3D User Interfaces, Theory and Practice. His research papers have had around 14,000 citations, which is really incredible. He's served in many roles for IEEE Virtual Reality, and he also co-founded the IEEE Symposium on 3D User Interfaces, which is now a normal part of IEEE VR. He received a career award from the National Science Foundation for his work on 3D interaction and has been named an ACM Distinguished Scientist. He also received the Technical Achievement Award from the IEEE Visualization and Graphics Technical Committee in 2014. So today he's going to speak on augmented reality as the future of personal computing. Before we move on, I'd just like to thank Sylvia Pan in London for setting up the technical arrangements for this today. And later questions on the YouTube site will be fielded by Shakiba Davari and Feu Lu in Virginia. So now I pass over to Doug.
All right, well, thank you very much, Mel. Appreciate the introduction, and I also appreciate your initiative in setting up these seminars. I think this is really great, and for everyone who's here, I hope that you're doing well and staying safe and healthy, and maybe for the next hour or so, you can take your mind off of coronavirus and think about something more fun like AR. So I'm gonna share my screen here. Okay. Hopefully that looks okay to everyone. If not, Sylvia, please let me know. And I forgot to thank Sylvia as well for her support in organizing these talks and all the technical stuff. So thank you very much. All right, so as Mel said, I want to talk today about augmented reality as the future of personal computing. And that's a pretty grandiose title. I'm not a very grandiose person, but maybe I can convince you to think about AR in some different ways today. But I want to start by just talking about some of my own background in both VR and AR. So I started out as a VR researcher as a graduate student at Georgia Tech back in the late 90s. And so I've been around VR for a good while, and I've done a lot of fundamental research projects on 3D interaction, but I've been involved in probably just as many applied VR research projects where we were trying to take VR technology and use it for particular application domains and use cases and see how effective it could be. So I put some of them on the slide here. You can see that I have a propensity for garish colors in a lot of these. I didn't realize that until just now. But we've used VR for architectural design. We've used it for landscape design visualization. We've used it for abstract information visualization. We've used it for civil engineering in underground spaces. We've used it for training workers in mining engineering. We've used it for visualization of biomechanical data. We've used it for military training and so on. So lots of different applications. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, of course, of what VR can be applied to. I actually haven't been involved in AR nearly as long as I've been involved in VR, only over the last 5 to 8 years have I really been doing more augmented reality work. And so I've only got a couple of application examples here. In fact, 2 of these pictures are from the same application, the 2 on the left. That was a handheld AR application to teach students about a historical site here near Virginia Tech, and to get them to engage in historical inquiry by engaging them with AR. And then the one on the right is an application of, again, building design in situ using augmented reality as a way to understand how the size and volume of proposed buildings would fit in with the surrounding space. So some applications of AR as well. But I guess what I want to say about all of these is not just to say that I've done a lot of cool stuff, but to say that all of this prior work, these applied VR and AR examples, could really be described as very special purpose or very niche. They are applications that would only be relevant to a few users in certain circumstances and used for a specific reason. That doesn't mean they're unimportant, but it means that they maybe don't have as much impact as we think VR and AR might have impact. In contrast, when we use computing in general, we could describe it as general purpose or ubiquitous. I would venture to say that more or less everyone who is listening to this talk uses computing of some form every day for much of the day and for a huge number of reasons. And those uses of computing, of course, continue to increase. It's really ubiquitous in most of our work, especially for those in knowledge work, and beyond work as well, of course, in many of our personal lives. So this is, that I applied that to my own story of research, but I think that I'm not unique in this, in thinking that most of the uses of VR and AR have been special purpose. So I did this Google search a little while back, but I think it's still pretty relevant. I just typed into Google, what's augmented reality good for? And here were 3 of the top sites that came up. These were all articles that were trying to tell lay people, why would you want to care about augmented reality? What applications could you use AR for? And so you can see some of the categories there. So military applications, medical applications, navigation, sightseeing, maintenance and repair, gaming, advertising, retail, design and modeling, tourism, etc. Right? So these are all important applications. They could be relevant to a reasonably large number of people for some of the time, but they're not general purpose computing. So hold on to that thought for a second. I want to shift gears and talk about how big tech companies, like in this case Microsoft and Magic Leap, are making huge investments into augmented reality. And here are 2 of the most popular or most state-of-the-art AR head-worn displays that are in use today. So the HoloLens 2 on the left, or the Magic Leap 1 on the right. And these are really impressive technical achievements. They solve a lot of the problems that AR systems have seen in the past, but they're not quite yet consumer devices, right? They're more developer kits. They're still too heavy. They still have a limited field of view. They still have not enough compute power. And there's still not enough applications and content on these to make them truly kind of consumer devices. But it's widely thought that in the near future, where near is defined as something from 3 to 10 years from now, we will have AR glasses that solve most of these technical problems that our current systems have. So these future AR glasses should have a wide field of view. They should have a light eyeglass type form factor. They should have an all-day battery life. They should be bright and usable outdoors, and they should have really good head and eye tracking. And so they could be consumer devices at that point, but only if enough consumers are willing to buy them, right? So kind of combining the two thoughts so far, if we think about what AR applications have been typically proposed by people in the research community like me, or by people who wrote those articles that I showed you from the Google search, there seems to be a bit of a disconnect. I would ask you to think about this question. Would you buy these future AR glasses that I described if what it provided to you were what was applications in areas like training, education, navigation, sightseeing, gaming, interior design, and advertising? Again, all super fun, maybe super cool, useful in certain situations. But I'm guessing that you wouldn't be willing to shell out, let's say, $1,000 for a system that would just do these things, because they're just not general purpose enough. And I guess I could, kind of bring this point home by asking you, would you buy a smartphone if it only has these applications? And of course you wouldn't, right? So that leads us to the question of, when will augmented reality be widely desirable? And so I think, of course, I'm not the first person to think about this, and I probably don't have the deepest thoughts about this either. But it seems pretty obvious to me that if we look at how smartphones became popular, we could maybe understand why AR glasses might become popular as well. So think about the kind of rise of the smartphone. Of course, you could use them to play games and to check the weather and to do navigation via GPS. But I don't think people bought smartphones because of those features. Instead, I think that people bought smartphones because they could handle most of the things that you wanted to do on your PC. So you couldn't write a Word document on your smartphone. I mean, you could, but you wouldn't want to. But all the sort of information access tasks that you would do on your PC, you could do on your phone, and they were much more convenient, right? And your phone, your smartphone also, of course, has a phone, which is pretty important, messaging and voice communication. If you remember the idea of personal digital assistants, Palm Pilots and such, that was another device that smartphones could replace, and of course they could replace your camera. And it could do all these things more conveniently and have all the bonus applications, right? So my hypothesis would be that AR would follow a similar trajectory. So in other words, when AR glasses can do most of the things that we do currently on PCs and tablets and smartphones, it could do them in a more convenient way and have other kind of bonus features, then that's the point at which consumers will be willing to purchase these devices. So I don't think that will happen with these kind of special purpose and niche application areas that we talked about. I think it has to be something different. So an alternative view of future AR, and again, I'm not the first one to suggest this by a long stretch, but AR glasses could be used not just for kind of immersive 3D sort of applications, but they could be used to replace every other display that we currently use. So replace your smartphone display with a virtual display through AR glasses, but also replace your smartwatch, your tablet, your laptop, your desktop monitor, your TV, your projector. All of those displays could be virtual and seen through AR glasses, right? And not only that, we couldn't just kind of replicate the displays that we currently have with virtual displays, but we can add value as well. So think about if displays are virtual, what the benefits would be. So first of all, you can work anywhere, right? I have a pretty nice multi-monitor setup here in front of me. I could replicate that in any location without compromising computing and display power. I could have any number of virtual monitors in any configuration, so I can rearrange things easily for different tasks that I want to do. Basically, I can take my office with me anywhere I go. And unlike smartphones, it will be pretty easy to access full-size documents, images, and websites while you're mobile, right? So you can access those things on your smartphone, but they're on a tiny screen currently. There's no limitation on screen size with virtual displays seen through AR glasses. There's also a privacy benefit, right? So people can't see what you're looking at on your AR glasses the same way that they could see what you're looking at on your laptop. But you should be able to explicitly share information with others. You could receive notifications without having to look at a separate display. And you could combine kind of these special purpose 3D immersive AR applications with normal 2D applications like web browsers and email clients. So again, I'm not by far the first person to make this claim. Here's a claim from 2006 from this book called The End of Hardware, which basically says the same thing. It says that virtual objects and virtual devices will soon replace most of today's user interface hardware and screens. He also says that they would replace keyboards, and I'm not so sure about that. I'll talk more about that in a bit. And he says that, you know, once this happens, it will start an avalanche. If you had a pair of glasses that was basically a mobile phone, that would be a killer app. So that's the direction that I'd like us to think about. And it's worth noting that you know, some big companies, big players in the tech industry are also thinking in the same direction. So here's a project from Microsoft Research about using mixed reality displays, not an optical see-through AR display, but a similar technology, using that to kind of expand and do a virtual multi-monitor type of setup, even when you're just carrying around your laptop. And the HoloLens, of course, has also been pitched this way. And if you've played around with the HoloLens too, you know it does a lot of these kind of 2D apps, any Windows app really, that can be loaded into your 3D augmented reality environment. So the claim from all of this, and this is all just intro really, the claim is that the killer use case for AR is general purpose computing. And we will need all day wearable AR glasses to make this, this killer use case a reality. So what I want to talk about for the rest of the talk are some challenges. And I'm not going to really talk about technical challenges because that's not my area. I'm not going to talk about making wider field of view displays or about improving tracking quality or anything like that. I'm going to talk about user experience challenges. So in other words, how do we design these general purpose AR systems? So here's a list of questions that I'm going to address, and I'm going to address them one by one, so I won't read them now. And this is by far, it's far from a comprehensive list of UX challenges for general purpose AR, but these are just some things that we've been thinking about in my group, which might be interesting for you to think about as well. So the first and probably the most obvious question is, how are we going to give input? How are we going to interact in these general purpose AR systems? So our smartphones have built-in input devices, our desktop PCs have built-in input devices, but if everything becomes virtual, then input might become a lot harder. So the good news for kind of replacing your office setup with AR is that you don't have to get rid of the input devices, right? You can just use your traditional mouse and trackpad and keyboard. And so here's an image and also a video taken through the HoloLens 2 of using virtual screens for kind of general purpose desktop computing. And all the interaction here is being done with just a traditional Bluetooth mouse and keyboard. So you have that in your office, or you carry that with you, and then you can have these virtual displays and use them just the way that you use your current desktop computer. Okay, so that's not too hard. What about when you're mobile though? So this is a more difficult question. The first thing that most people go to are gestures, speech sort of commands, and maybe eye tracking. And those are definitely the most convenient forms of input for mobile general purpose AR, because they are things that they don't require us to carry anything with us, right? It just uses our bodies to give input. And so it's definitely most convenient, and I think it can also be sufficient for many information access and information consumption tasks. On the other hand, if we need to do more complex interactions like create content, and especially enter text, gestures and speech and eye tracking are probably not going to be sufficient for that. So one idea is, well, some of these early AR glasses especially might be powered by your mobile phone. And so if the phone is doing the computing, the multi-touch surface on the phone or the other sensors in the phone could also be used for input. So that's a possibility. And then the final possibility is that we might have some alternative wearable input devices. And I've shown one of those over on the right. This is something called the Tap Strap, which is a wearable cord keyboard, basically, to allow you to do text entry with a single hand. And it just requires you to wear this thing over your knuckles and have a surface to tap on. And so that's a possibility as well. Maybe I'll be wearing something like this all the time and can use it in whatever context I find myself in. But still a lot of open questions there. The second question I wanted to address is, how can we design around the trade-offs of purely virtual screens or apps? So I mentioned earlier a lot of the benefits of having general purpose AR displays or applications. So unlimited number of screens, screens that can be any size and any spatial layout, work anywhere, have visual privacy, etc. But you were probably thinking at the time, yeah, but there's lots of downsides as well. And so I've listed some of those here. So first of all, current AR systems are not very comfortable. They're too heavy. The form factor is not comfortable for long-term use, especially. They're nothing like wearing eyeglasses. It's more like wearing a VR head-mounted display. And beyond that, they can give people eye strain and neck strain, and they can make people sick in some ways. The current AR systems also have low field of view, so I can't see very much virtual content at any one time. I have to turn my head a lot to see the virtual content. The content is never fully opaque. You can always see through it a bit. And here I'm talking about optical see-through AR systems, obviously. And current AR systems have quite a bit lower resolution than the screens that we use on our phones and on our desktops. And so those last three things all together really give you problems with readability. So anything that's heavy on text, even if it's just trying to read web pages or documents, would really be hurt by current AR systems. There's also extra window management overhead. So if we want to realize these benefits of like putting up an unlimited number of screens and arranging them just the way we want for various tasks, that's a lot of work to set that up and to change it as I change from one task to another. So there's extra interaction that has to be done. And then finally, there's this issue of the fixed accommodation distance, where all current AR and VR displays, at least the ones that you can buy, have a virtual screen that's at a fixed distance. And so if we're displaying virtual content that's supposed to be at another distance, then we get this accommodation divergence conflict, which can cause eye strain and headaches and other things like that. I think most of these cons are technical, right? And many of them I think will be solved fairly easily, just as technology kind of continues its inevitable improvement. So I think the weight and comfort issues and low field of view and the low resolution, those problems will go away pretty soon, just as technology continues to improve. The ones I've bolded here, though, are a little bit harder. So the fully opaque AR is a current research area, but it's a long ways to go before that's practical. Fixing the accommodation divergence conflict is also a research issue, and there's still a ways to go before those systems are practical. But really, the only one that is not a technical issue that I've listed here is this issue of window management. And so I think if you want to do UX design research for general purpose AR, this would be an interesting direction to go. So we've started to look at that just a bit in my group. We have been doing virtual screens for desktop computing, again, shown in the image on the left and also in this video on the right. So in both of these cases, we are showing a hybrid setup where there's a physical monitor in the center and virtual monitors off to the side. So it's like a 3-monitor setup, but where 2/3 of it is presented through AR and 1/3 is a real monitor. And this has some advantages because you get the kind of high resolution readable display for your kind of central task, and then you can have other content off to the side that's maybe not as important, that's secondary, that's glanceable, things like this. The other thing that we've been trying is to address a little bit of the accommodation divergence conflict, even with current displays, just by making the virtual screens farther away and larger. So the HoloLens 2 has an accommodation distance of about 2 meters. So we moved our virtual screens out to a distance of 2 meters and then just enlarged them so that they took up the same visual angle as the physical monitor. And that seems to work pretty well in terms of reducing eye strain. So some ideas there, but more work needs to be done. Another question, if you're going to do general purpose AR for these 2D apps, is how should the content be registered? In other words, where should the content live? Should it live on the display itself? In other words, be registered to the head so that as you move your head around and walk around, that content stays in the same place on the physical display? Should it be registered to the body so that as you walk, the content moves with you? Or should it be registered to the world and kind of sit in the same physical location on top of your table or attached to your wall or whatever? And so this video shows a simulation of all 3 of these. We've got this weather app, which is head registered. Let me just play that again. This weather app, which is head registered, and this second app with Mozart on it, I guess a music app that was body registered, and then an email app, which is world registered. So I think the answer to the question is yes. Content should be registered in all 3 of these ways. It's just that different tasks, different contexts, and different apps might need different types of content registration. And so it's hard to know a priori what that's going to be in advance. And we probably don't want users to always have to manually specify how the content should be registered every time they open an app. So to me, the key is really intelligent adaptation. So how can apps kind of intelligently change the way that they are registered based on what the user is doing or what the user's intent is? So let me show some examples of that. So this is a kind of a follow-up question. How should virtual content adapt itself to the real world context? And specifically, some of the ways that it might need to adapt itself would be to avoid occlusion. So we don't want to block important objects or information in the real world with virtual content. And we also want to facilitate the transition between kind of working with real world objects and people and working with virtual content as well. So a couple of obvious ideas here. One is that content that's placed near physical walls and other surfaces might snap to those surfaces. That might make sense. It might also make sense for certain content to follow the user's walking trajectory. So if the content is something you want to keep using as you move from place to place, then the content can kind of follow you and be available to you when you need it. So one of my students who graduated last year explored some of these issues in his dissertation. This is Wallace Lagis's work. And so this is a simulation of using 2D apps through a HoloLens. So you can kind of arrange the windows the way that you want. But then there's various behaviors that the apps can follow, depending on what button you press on a controller. So one behavior is they're kind of head fixed as you turn and move, the content moves with you. You can also tell the content to go attach itself to the nearest wall surface that's more or less in the direction that you're looking at to give it more kind of a world fixed flavor. You can also have the content follow you while you walk, but not be attached to your head. So this is body registered content so that I can read it while I walk and turn to face different parts of the content. And it's always kind of available at the same distance relative to my body. Now, I probably wouldn't want the content directly in front of my face like this while I was walking, but you get the idea. And then another example of attaching it to the wall. So this work found that definitely the preferred behaviors were context sensitive. So people wanted different behaviors depending on what they were doing at the time, whether they were focused on moving from place to place, whether they were focused on having a conversation with someone, whether they were focused on gathering some information from the content or applying that information to the real world. And so we can take this and hopefully design intelligent adaptive systems that would kind of know what behaviors to use given what they observe the user doing. We've also addressed this question of occlusion management. And again, the problem here is that we want to make sure that important real world people, objects, information don't get blocked by our virtual content. We don't want people to have to necessarily move the virtual content out of the way or close the virtual content in order to, for example, have a conversation with someone. So how can we create adaptive user interfaces that will manage this occlusion for us? And so we explored a number of different dimensions here. One was kind of how the adaptation takes place, and we looked at transparency and position adaptation. So transparency is what it sounds like. The content gets mostly transparent so you can see through it. Position adaptation means the content moves out of the way so you can see the important real world information. We looked at real world priority versus virtual content priority. So which one is more important in the current task? Is it more important that we keep tabs on what's happening in the real world, or is it more important that we can read and use the virtual content? What's kind of the default setting? And then finally, we looked at kind of how the adaptation happens. Was it completely automatic? Was it completely manual? Or we had a third case in the middle where we detected the occlusion and notified the user about it, but required the user then to kind of confirm that the occlusion should be resolved. So here's another video that shows some of those cases. So this is obviously taken in video see-through AR, but it kind of simulates what you might see in an AR system. So there are these different virtual apps that are hanging in space around you. And you saw there that in this case, they started out translucent and the user could click on them to make them more opaque. Here's another example where they're starting out in the normal position, but you can move them up and out of the way, or you can, again, make them transparent if you want. Here's the case where they're starting up and out of the way. And if you want to read them more carefully, you can click on them to bring them down. So this is not showing any of the automatic behaviors, but it's showing kind of the manual behaviors and the different types of content adaptation that we considered. So what we did is, and this is Shakiba Devari's work, who's on the call here. What we did was run a study in a simulated AR environment where we had people do a task that involved both monitoring the real world and answering questions from the virtual content. So let me set this up a little bit. So the primary task was to monitor this this little boy that you see here, and the story was that he's your cousin, and you're watching him, and he is autistic and needs to every now and then make sure that you are paying attention to him, and so every now and then he'll wave to you, and it's very important that when he waves that you acknowledge that wave. So you want to keep tabs on him. At the same time, you're watching TV, and every now and then on the TV, a question will pop up like, what's the temperature now? Or how many steps have you walked today, or whatever. And you're required to answer that question from the virtual content. So we had a bunch of different conditions where we looked at kind of performance on these tasks and also user preference for these different techniques. So I'll show you a couple of the conditions. This first one is where the content has real world priority. So in other words, it starts out as transparent, so you can see the real world without much occlusion. And when you need to use the content, you manually make it opaque. So here's that one. So we can watch the boy. At one point, a question comes up. It's about the weather. So we make the weather app opaque, we get the information, and we click on it. We go to another trial, and here we'll see that the boy waves, and so we respond to the wave by pointing at the ceiling. And then we also have to answer a question from one of the apps. Another condition here, that's the same one, sorry. So another condition here, this is an automatic occlusion management solution where wherever the child is, the content that's blocking him will move up and out of the way. And so you can both keep tabs on him, but also get quick access to the information from the virtual content. So that gives you an idea of what the conditions we looked at in the study. Here were some of the results. So the graph here is just overall preference for techniques. And you can see that half the people in the study overall preferred the condition translucency, real world prioritized. And what that means is that this was a manual technique. So users had to click on the content to make it opaque or translucent. It's real world prioritized, which means that it started out as translucent. And so it started out with being able to see the real world and the little boy in particular, no matter where he was and all the time. And if a question was asked, you had to click on the content to make it opaque. And that was the most preferred technique. That was a little bit surprising to us because the automatic techniques, they were the second and third most preferred, but this manual technique was by far the most preferred. And so in interviewing people, what we determined is that people really didn't like the visual clutter and distraction of all the virtual content being available all the time. They really only wanted to bring up that virtual content when they needed it. They did prefer the automation over manual kind of in general and over the notifications. But the automation only worked in one direction. In other words, it only worked to resolve occlusions of real content by virtual content. It didn't work if a question popped up where it would automatically kind of show you that content. You still had to manually click on it. So that's a direction for future work. Still thinking about this question of adaptation, another kind of sub question to ask here is, what context does such an adaptive system need to detect? So there was one example in that prior study, the context of monitoring an important real world piece of information, like where this little boy was. But what other context do we need to detect, and how do we detect them? So to start addressing this question, we've been thinking about various scenarios for general purpose AR and types of adaptations based on context that we think would be useful. And so I want to show this video, which is just kind of again, a concept video that we put together. This is not a real system. This was kind of Wizard of Oz, but it shows various contexts that could be detected and ways that the AR system could adapt. So let me play this, and I'll just talk over it while it goes. So this user is kind of sitting and reading some information about taking care of a plant. The first thing that happens is she moves her teacup, and she moves it right where the information was. And so the information kind of moves out of the way because we know we want to be able to see the teacup so we can drink while we're sitting at the table. Then the system is also aware of the user standing up and walking to another part of the room. And it infers that she's actually going to go try to take care of the plant that she was just reading about. And so it kind of summarizes the information, and the information moves along with her while she walks. The system also detects when she completes the various steps of plant care. So when she opens the window, it detects that she's given it more light. When she pours the water in, it detects that she's taking care of that. And when she cleans off the leaves of the plant, it detects that she's taking care of that. So again, we're not doing any of this stuff actually, but we're kind of exploring whether this might be a useful sort of context-dependent AR. And then finally, as she turns and walks away, she still has the content in front of her, but the system detects that her friend is there and wants to have a conversation with her. So it minimizes the content into this small little visual target. But when she needs to access the content, she can look at that target to access it again, and then look away again in order to continue the conversation. So those are some of the contexts that we think might be useful for general purpose AR of this sort. Okay, let me move on to the next question. How can we allow information to be accessed on the go without distracting the user or compromising safety? So a lot of the use cases for this are not just sitting at your desk, they are mobile use cases. And There's been lots of study of people checking their mobile phone or checking their smartwatch or whatever while they're outside walking, while they're crossing the street, maybe even while they're driving, although we're not supposed to do that. And so if we're doing this with AR glasses, how do we allow quick information access without distraction and without compromising safety? So we did another experiment where we studied 3 different techniques, and rather than describe them here, I think I'll just show the video which describes them for you. And this is the work of my student Fei Yu, who's also on the call. So kind of the baseline would be to use just a heads-up display, where all this virtual content that we want is kind of always visible. But the problem with that, of course, is that it also can block important parts of the real world and be distracting. So we're looking at this idea of glanceable AR, where the content is not distracting, but it can be accessed at a glance in some way. So we did have a baseline heads-up display type interface that we call the iGlance interface, and you see that here. This is done on the Magic Leap 1. The second was something we called gaze summon, which had these little kind of unobtrusive visual targets, and when you dwelled on them with your gaze for half a second, the related content would kind of move into the field of view, and then it would go away when you looked away again. And then we had this head glance technique, where the content is off in the periphery, it's body registered, and so you can access it by turning your head away from the central forward direction, and then look back and not have that forward direction be blocked at all. We studied these in the context of a primary task, which was walking. So we had the user follow a virtual character and try to keep the same distance away from that character. Oops, got some sound here. And the secondary task was either to answer questions that the system would ask you verbally, or to monitor this basketball scoreboard and report lead changes. So let me skip ahead to the results. Maybe. Oh, this is the playback system we use to do some deeper analysis. The basic findings were both head glance and eye glance were faster than gaze summon because it didn't have this dwell. Whoops, I skipped too far. It didn't have this dwell characteristic. Eye glance was more preferred when continuous attention was required on the information. So if you needed to monitor the basketball scoreboard, for example, it was useful to have that on a heads-up display. And the head glance and eye glance weren't considered to be suitable for frequent usage over a short duration. So we asked people questions pretty frequently, probably more frequently than you would want to check the information in real life. So we plan to do more follow-up studies on more realistic sorts of scenarios. So after this, we designed a new technique that we thought is kind of addressed some of the downsides of the techniques that we studied in the experiment. We call this Head Glance Plus. And the idea of Head Glance Plus is that we still fix the content to your body and it's outside your field of view, but it's still only displayed as these kind of minimal visual targets when you turn to look at it with your head. And you only get visibility for it when your eyes actually converge onto that visual target. So the visual target is quite close to you. And if you kind of look through the visual target to the real world beyond, you don't see the content, but only when you converge your eyes to look at the visual target do you see the content. So I have a video of this. It's really hard to tell what's happening in the video because you can't feel your eyes moving in the video, but you see these kind of 4 visual targets. And only when you, again, kind of look at the visual target, which is quite close to you with both eyes, does the content appear. And this feels really magical. So you can look in any direction and see the real world. And only when you kind of directly request it with your eye movements do you get the visual content. Okay, so I need to wrap up. Here are some take-home messages. We're just starting to study this sort of thing, and there's lots still to be done, but here are some things that I'd like you to leave the talk with. So first of all, AR is not just for immersive and 3D content. I know a lot of people have realized that all along, but I certainly didn't, and I think a lot of researchers don't. I think a lot of researchers think that we should use AR for 3D, we should use AR for immersive because that's what it's designed for. but it really can be used and has lots of great benefits for these general purpose applications. So using AR for personal computing and knowledge work in particular is a significant future opportunity. And I think the tech companies realize this, which is why they might be pouring so much money into the development of these AR devices. AR systems for general purpose scenarios, though, need to be designed very carefully in order to get an effective user experience. And I've addressed a few of the open UX questions. There are many more. And lastly, I'd say that this is the right time to do this research because we have solid AR technology, but it's not yet a consumer device, right? So that gives us a window. Before general purpose AR is a commercial reality, we have a window to do some research and maybe influence how these systems are designed. So to wrap up, the last thing I want to say is that we are doing our best. All these studies that I've presented and prototypes that I've presented so far are really kind of mock-ups and fakes and so on, and we can get some information from those. But in order to really understand the user experience with these systems, we need to have real AR systems that people can actually do work with or can actually use for real tasks in their daily life. So we've done that in a couple of ways, or we're starting to do that in a couple of ways, I should say. We have one prototype system on the HoloLens 2, which I showed some videos of earlier, which is focused on office productivity. And so in that prototype, we have real Windows applications that run on these virtual monitors, and we use mouse and keyboard in the same way we always do to control those applications. And we're looking at various enhancements to that, like adaptive size and distance for improved readability and comfort. And I have my student with that at home and doing a lot of his actual work using that system and kind of recording his reflections about that work. Also, we're designing a prototype system on the Magic Leap 1 that is focused on these glanceable applications. So more like smartphone applications, quick information access sorts of tasks. And my student, Fei Yu, has recently connected these to real data sources. So you can actually log in via your Google account and get your Gmail through these glanceable apps. You can see your local weather and so on. There's a notification system, and these apps can be world or body registered. So just as we conclude, I'm going to show one more video, which is hot off the presses. This was created yesterday. Here's a use of this system. Kind of, it starts out in a desktop mode, and the glanceable apps are arranged around his monitor. So he can look, for example, at a task list to remember what he's supposed to do, and then use his regular computer to do those tasks. He's setting a timer so that he doesn't work for too long without taking a break. And he's got quick access to his calendar and his Gmail and so on. As this continues, he gets a notification eventually. Here it comes, I think. Oh, so he can mark off one of his tasks. He finished his coding task. He's going to get a notification that his timer is over, and so it's rest time now. So he can take a quick look at his activity ring, and as he gazes at that for a few seconds, he'll see he hasn't done much activity today, and he gets some details. So he decides to go outside and take a walk during his break time. He doesn't have a meeting for a while. So this is pretty interesting. He can now get up and with the press of a button, obviously this is not the way we do it in practice, but with the press of a button, he can bring some apps that are relevant to his walk into a body registered mode. And so now he has his music app and his weather app and his activity ring app that can go along with him on his walk. He can start by kind of choosing some songs for to listen to during his walk, control those with gestures. And as he walks, he can get a notification from his activity ring saying, okay, you've walked enough now, and can also notice that the sky is getting dark and check his weather app and realize that it might be time to go home. So finally, fast forward a little bit here. He can get back to his apartment. And again, with the press of a button, those glanceable apps kind of redock around his monitor and he can continue his work. So again, we're developing this to be a real system that you could really use for your day-to-day tasks, and gathering kind of reflections on that and continually redesigning based on that. All right, so I just want to acknowledge my students and other collaborators and funding sources. And with that, I would be happy to take questions.
Hello. So thanks very much. An excellent talk, and I think this glimpse into the not too distant future is really important. And questions have started to come in, so I'm going to take first of all the very first question I saw, which I think is someone from YouTube. Armin M says, what factor, I don't quite understand this question myself, but I'll pass it over to you. What factor of XR being niche for those not already in the community do you think will be phased out the quickest? Computing power, fidelity, portability, price point?
Yeah, I guess I think I get that question. In other words, which of the kind of current downsides of AR systems or XR systems will get resolved most quickly? It's really hard for me to predict technological improvements, but I guess I think that computing power might be the thing that's easiest to resolve on this list. As I said, I think a lot of the early AR glasses are probably going to be driven by smartphones. So the computing power that's already in your smartphone. And so, you know, that kind of makes it a lot easier. You don't have to build all the computing directly into the glasses, and that also helps with the form factor and weight sort of issue. So I think that will help to get these glasses pushed out into consumer devices earlier than they might be otherwise.
Thanks very much. The next question is from Vino Vinayagamurthy. Hello, Vino. I find it interesting that we're still thinking of Windows management. Should we be thinking of other ways to work in the AR medium without Windows?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it's one that I've heard a lot. So there definitely is this, I mean, we're not constrained to 2D, we're not constrained to rectangular boundaries for 2D content and so on. But on the other hand, so there's this idea that we should be much more flexible, I think, in designing for AR. But on the other hand, I don't think that we should necessarily kind of throw away the decades of development and design and familiarity that we have with windowed type systems. It's hard to think of something that would be as useful and as understandable and as simple when we're talking about kind of basic informational content. So no, it doesn't have to be in Windows, but I think it's likely to evolve that way, and then maybe things will gradually get less constrained as time goes along. So I think it's worthwhile to start at least by thinking about adapting the windows that we know about from our computers and our smartphones to this AR medium.
Thanks. The name is from someone with a very appropriate name. The name is ARMRXR, and it says, most communication I can see on the streets is not real time, it's not video, it's time displaced voice messages or text. It's not FaceTime. I question if there's really a demand for what you've described.
Okay. Well, I apologize if I gave the impression that we were mostly addressing kind of real-time communication between people through AR. Most of what we're looking at actually is not about that at all. Most of what we're looking at is kind of, if you're in the mobile case, we're looking at information access. So kind of real-time use and consumption of information from apps like we currently do on our smartphones. So what's the weather like right now? What's the most recent email I received? You know, what was that text that I just heard the notification for? There certainly are applications of kind of real-time video communication through AR, but that's not the primary use case that we're addressing. In the kind of desktop productivity scenario that I described, that's not really the case either. There, it's not really about communication at all. It's about kind of getting productive work done through the web and through documents and video editing and 3D modeling and all the other sorts of things that we do on our desktop computers. So I think that is a use case, but it's not, I think, the primary one, and it's not the one that we're addressing most closely right now.
Thanks. The next question, and I'd like to put a rider myself to this question in after you finish the first answer. So this is from Michael Bonfert, who says, currently the flood of notifications is a major challenge of dealing with your smartphone. How can we protect the user from constant notification overload in their field of view and give them control over it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's something that I'm really concerned about. So, you know, a big objection to this vision of general purpose AR is just that it's going to make this information overload problem even worse. That, you know, we won't even have to pull our phones out of our pockets or glance down at our watch in order to check a notification or to get information. They're just going to be flooding in all the time. So I think we as designers definitely do have to be very conscious of that and design these systems to prioritize the real world, as I said, and to make sure that distractions are limited, especially in particular contexts. So that's why I think context detection is so important. What is the user doing right now, and what is like safe to present to them? It's also important to do this kind of methods for information access work that I was talking about, so that it's not just that information gets presented on your glasses as soon as it's available, but that we allow the user to decide when it's safe and relevant to look at that information. That's why I really like this head glance plus technique that I showed briefly, because by default, you don't see any virtual information except for these tiny targets that are off in your periphery. And so you have to make a conscious choice that, okay, I need to know what the weather is right now. And so instead of sticking my hand in my pocket and pulling out my phone and bringing up the app, instead I just do a quick eye movement. I can get that information and then I can go back to interacting with the real world. So that I'm very conscious of that. And I think there's more work to do there. We have to balance the kind of ease of accessing the information with the need to prioritize the real world, not only for safety, but also to, like, you know, maintain social relationships and so on. That's why I think this work that Shakiba is currently doing about detecting conversation. So she's trying to detect conversations between the AR user and other people so that the AR interface can basically go away and you can be focused completely on the conversation. So really interesting, I think, and I look forward to seeing, you know, more stuff come out about that.
Thanks. So my rider to that is, because I was going to leave it till later, but it's very relevant, is that I have this vision in a few years of everyone walking around in the street wearing AR glasses, like ordinary eyeglasses. And then if we think today about the web, well, not just the web, but anything, there's free apps and there's apps that you pay for. And the thing with the free apps is you get adverts. So you're walking along the street with the AR glasses, and virtual character after virtual character is coming over to you all the time. Will you buy this? Will you buy that? Will you buy this? If you buy it, the ads stop. But if you don't buy it, you're bombarded all the time.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Mel. Yeah, that's definitely a real concern as well. I don't know how many people have seen this concept video called Hyper Reality, I believe. Keiichi Matsuda, I believe, is the filmmaker, which shows a kind of a very dystopian vision of future AR, which is basically exactly what you described, that you are constantly bombarded by ads wherever you go that are, ads that are related to the place that you're in or the thing that you're doing or whatever. And yeah, I mean, I think that's something that is going to have to be addressed. But that's, again, all the more reason why I think it's important that the kind of foundational systems, the operating system user interface, if you will, of these AR glasses has to prioritize lack of distraction and safety and so on. And if advertising is going to be a part of like the revenue stream for future AR apps, then it has to be done in a way that that is safe and that doesn't drive people away from using the technology. And I'm not sure what that is.
Thanks. Muhassin asks, there are studies that show that people usually underestimate the distance in a virtual environment. Did you look into human perception challenges?
Right. So there's a couple pieces of good news about this, I think. Yes, I'm definitely aware of the research about distance underestimation in VR. There's less information about distance underestimation or distance perception problems in AR, although there's been some studies that have shown that it still may exist, but it's maybe a little bit better than it is in pure VR. But the other piece of good news is that most of the sorts of interfaces I'm thinking about don't really require accurate distance perception. We don't, because we're mostly showing 2D content, and the kind of depth of that 2D content doesn't really matter as long as it's readable, then that probably won't have as much of an effect on these sorts of general purpose AR systems that I'm talking about as compared to the more 3D immersive apps for AR, like I showed the the building design application in AR. If you don't have good distance perception there, that could really cause you to make wrong decisions that could cost millions of dollars and so on. But that's not really the case with most of these information access tasks.
Thanks. I'll just pass on one message from Christopher Clark, who says, fantastic talk, Doug. Thanks very much. There's another question from Vino, who asked one before. She said, are you looking at any audio-led interactions using hearables or audio AR things?
I think that's a really important question, and the answer is no. We haven't looked at any of that yet, but that could be a big part of the potential solution to the visual distraction stuff that I was talking about, or the visual occlusion stuff that I was talking about. I don't have enough expertise in kind of doing auditory interaction or auditory display, but I would love to collaborate with some people who are doing that to improve the design of these systems.
Thanks. There's a question from, I can hardly read this, Strandesverferdo. How do you imagine app-to-app interaction? There's a big difference between windows with apps versus objects in a physical simulation.
So I'm not completely sure I understand the question. Yeah, I wouldn't. I could like speculate and answer something that I think he's asking, but I'm not really sure. So, I mean, in general, I think there's a lot of kind of software technical issues to work out that we are not currently working on. So, APIs and inter-process communication and all of these things. Any kind of real AR operating system or OS for AR glasses is going to have to deal with those things. It has to run real apps, and those apps have to be able to communicate with one another and with the cloud and so on. But that's not really been the focus of this work.
Okay, thanks. How are you doing, Doug? Are you okay for some more questions?
Yeah, sure. A few more minutes would be fine.
Okay. From Florian Widener. Thanks for the great talk. My question is about simulated AR. In your opinion, how comparable do you think AR in VR is compared with the real AR? Or what should researchers pay special attention in using simulated AR?
Yeah, good question. So I showed the one study where we used simulated AR with the boy waving at you, and we've in general done quite a number of studies of that sort in recent years, and the main reason for doing these studies, of course, is that real AR systems are not quite robust enough or high powered enough or whatever to do the sorts of things that we want to do, or because you can't get really good experimental control if you're in actual AR, if you're working in the real world. So it would have been hard to have an actual little boy walking exactly where we wanted him to walk and waving exactly when we wanted him to wave. So we do a lot of these studies where we simulate AR in VR. There are definitely some downsides to doing that because the real world, the virtual world background is likely to be much less cluttered and messy than the real world background, and you don't have all this variability that you'll get in the real world. So you have to worry about the ecological validity of your studies for sure, but it's a great way to get some controlled experiments done and then hopefully take those studies out into real AR systems when that's possible and verify those results.
Thanks. There's two questions which are a bit related, so I'll put them both. One is, I don't know who it's from, there's no name, but it says, in the plant application, what do you have to do the object detection on the device? Can you train the device or upload it to the cloud, and it has to be trained there and managed by any provider? And someone else asks about dialog boxes. How can you make sure attention is focused in the location of the dialog box?
So as far as the first question goes, in that concept video I showed with the plant, we hadn't really thought at the time about how the context detection would actually be accomplished. And we showed some pretty sophisticated intelligent systems stuff there, right? So, you know, knowing exactly when the user poured the water into the plant and being able to detect that and then display it back to the user on the screen is pretty complicated, I think. And we're starting to look into some of those things now. Of course, it relates to computer vision and Internet of Things and all of that stuff. So that's a hurdle that has to be overcome. We really have wanted to explore, you know, what could you do if you understood these contexts, and how could you present information to the user and make it more useful than if that context hadn't been detected. As far as the dialog box question, I'm not sure what demo or video that I talked about they're referring to there. I don't think we had any modal dialog boxes in any of the examples that I showed, but I can see that there might be a need for those in some cases, just like we have in regular Windows applications or regular smartphone applications. I guess my easy answer to that question would be that I would probably put those important modal dialog boxes directly in the center of the display and make them head registered so that you couldn't not see them. That of course interacts with the, you know, with the safety and distraction sort of issue. So you'd have to worry about that. But if it's really something that the user has to take care of before they can continue, then you have to make sure that they can see it. It wouldn't make sense to make those world registered, for example, so that you could walk away from them.
Thanks. Frank Guan says, excellent talk. I saw there are quite a lot of scenario-based UX were introduced. This can help to share how these different scenarios are detected and understood, e.g. a cup in front of a user with AI. Right.
That's really what I was saying in response to the last question about context detection and the system understanding what the user is doing, the system understanding what's in the scene in front of the user, the system understanding what's important and what's not. There's a lot of kind of intelligent adaptive systems work to be done there, and we're just kind of scratching the surface on that right now. But I guess, you know, there are some fairly easy rules that we probably could apply. For example, I talked about the, you know, detecting a conversation. So we've thought a little bit about, what are the kind of key things that would let the system know that a conversation is happening between the AR user and someone else? Well, you hear a voice. That voice is not the voice of the user. That voice might say the user's name, or some keyword like hey or hi or hello. And the camera would probably see a face, and that face would probably be turned to face the user. So some combination of all of those kind of simple heuristics can probably get you a pretty decent like conversation detector algorithm. And I think we can apply similar sorts of heuristics, at least in the first round of this, to do some context-aware AR.
Okay. Jose Garcia asks, could it be necessary to train users into handling overlaying and acquire AR skills rather than expect that's enough with using a carefully designed user interface?
Yeah, so I don't think there's any way to avoid there being a learning curve when people, if people switch from their smartphone to AR glasses, for example. But I think we as UX designers can take them a lot of the way into having reasonable defaults and having automatic or adaptive behaviors that are right, a large percentage of the time. And then, training users to handle those few percent of other cases where the system doesn't do the right thing would have to be handled carefully. But hopefully that's not a huge amount of the interaction that new AR users would have to do.
Thanks. I think people are going to love this question. According to a recent leak, Apple might release their everyday life AR glasses in 2021 or the year after. Are we ready for this, or is it too ambitious?
No comment. No. It's a good question. We're not ready for it yet. I think I've illustrated that quite a bit in my talk with all these open UX questions. Although I imagine, the companies that are developing these AR consumer glasses are probably wrestling with a lot of the same questions and maybe have come up with more answers than we have already. It's hard to know. But I think, based on what's out there now in terms of interfaces and design guidelines and so on, there's still a lot that we need to know. At the same time, I kind of want these devices to come out soonish so that we have even more impetus to do the research. We have better platforms to do the research on, and so on. I just wouldn't want it to be the case that that these devices come out and the user experience is so poor that people decide that AR glasses are not a useful thing. So there's definitely a timing issue there. I imagine what's going to happen is that there may be quote AR glasses that come out in the next couple of years that are kind of consumer focused devices, but that they'll be more like slightly plussed up Google Glass or slightly plussed up wearable displays that don't necessarily take advantage of all the things that AR can do, and kind of ease people into it and gradually add more features, but that's just speculation.
Supriya Rao says, thank you so much, Dr. Bowman, for your time and excellent talk. I always learn a lot from your talks. I'm a graduate student and have developed a Magic Leap on HoloLens as part of my research. I believe AR is very promising technology and has the potential to have a huge number of innovative applications. I'd love to hear your thoughts on XR's benefit for workplace collaboration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Supriya, for the question and for the kind words. And let me preface this by saying, Mel, I think I'll make this the last question, if that's okay.
Okay.
So, right, I didn't talk about collaboration at all. I've talked only about kind of single user apps, which is obviously, kind of a good place to start. But we have to think about collaboration for AR because people are using this in the real world and in social situations. And if we get to this point where many people or most people have these AR glasses, then certainly it opens up lots of possibilities. You know, one problem is I discussed this kind of feature or benefit of AR glasses, that the displays are inherently private, but that's also a potential downside when you think about collaboration. So if my colleague walks over to my desk and I want to show them, you know, the design that I'm working on, in an AR system, I probably have to explicitly share it with them somehow, right? And making that kind of seamless and simple while still making sure that privacy is preserved is an open UX question. But I definitely, you know, kind of, again, look forward to the day when large numbers of people have these all-day wearable AR displays, because it opens up the possibility for lots of cool shared experiences that don't require any infrastructure, right? You can put these kind of displays of any sort, any size, 2D or 3D. You can place them anywhere and have everybody see them from their own individual points of view, and have a common experience and common ground. And that could be beneficial for all sorts of work and also for fun and entertainment. So that'll be a cool future.
One cool feature would be great to have is if you could hear everybody clapping right now. Thanks very much. So thanks for your excellent talk. And I'm just going to make some announcements before we end. So thank you again to Shakiba Davari, Feiyu Lu, and Sylvia Pan, different parts of the world from London and in Virginia. And I'd like to remind everyone that tomorrow, Sylvia Pan herself will be talking about virtual characters from training to immersive gaming. And this is tomorrow at 3 p.m. CEST, which is Paris, Madrid, London. Paris, Madrid, Berlin. So thanks very much to everybody, and we'll end the session now. Thanks again, Doug.